I work out in the oil fields, so I'm gone a lot, long stretches of time where I barely see my family. Molly, my wife, stays at home with the kids while I'm busting my back out there to provide. Things used to be good between us, you know? But the past few months, something's been off. Real off. It started with Molly spending more time with Frank, her brother-in-law. At first, I didn't think much of it. Frank's a good guy on the surface, married to Molly's sister, and we've all hung out as families do. But then, I noticed how often she was over there, even when his wife wasn't home. Just helping him out with some things, she'd say. Sure. The weird thing is, every time I came home after my shifts, the whole vibe of the house changed. Molly and the kids acted distant, like I was some stranger. The kids wouldn't run up to me like they used to, and Molly barely looked me in the eye. It's not like I'm expecting a parade when I walk in the door, but damn, it didn't feel right. I tried to shake it off at first. Maybe it was just me being tired or stressed from work. But my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. I started paying closer attention to Molly's behavior, more phone calls that she'd step outside to take, secretive smiles when she thought I wasn't looking. And Frank, well, he'd been popping by more than usual too. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there, being the fool in my own damn house. So I called up my best friend, Otis. Otis is the kind of guy who's got my back no matter what. We've known each other since high school, and if anyone could help me figure this mess out, it's him. I told him everything, how Molly was acting, her time with Frank, and how I felt like the odd man out in my own home. Otis didn't sugarcoat it. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Man, sounds like you need to keep your eyes open. Something ain't right." And that's when the gears started turning. I wasn't just going to sit back and let this play out. If Molly was cheating on me with Frank, I needed to know for sure. And I needed to be smart about it. I wasn't about to blow up our whole life without proof. That's when I started planning. I wasn't just going to confront her on a hunch. I was going to get the evidence I needed, no matter what it took. So, after talking to Otis, I started paying more attention. Every time I came back from a shift, I'd watch Molly more closely. She wasn't exactly hiding it, but she wasn't being obvious either. The weird part was how comfortable she seemed lying to me, acting like everything was normal. Oh, I was just helping Frank clean up the garage, or Frank needed some help with his taxes. Sure, I'm no genius, but I ain't stupid either. I'd see her texting late at night, smiling at her phone, and when I'd ask her about it, she'd give me some lame excuse like, just talking to my sister. Her sister. The same one who had no idea her husband and mine were getting real cozy. I tried not to show her I was onto something. I couldn't. I had to play it smart. Otis said it best. If she's hiding something, she'll slip up eventually. One night, I got back from the field earlier than expected. Molly didn't hear me come in. I found her sitting on the couch, looking a bit too comfortable on a call. When she realized I was standing there, she hung up real quick and smiled at me like nothing happened. "Oh hey babe. You're home early." "Yeah." Real casual. I asked her who she was talking to, and she pulled that same old line, "It's my sister." I didn't push it, just nodded and went to grab a beer from the fridge. I didn't need her getting suspicious of me. But that was it. My gut was screaming louder than ever now. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of her sneaking around behind my back, especially with Frank of all people, was driving me crazy. I thought about just storming over to Frank's place and demanding answers, but what good would that do without proof? So I called up a lawyer the next day while Molly was out. I needed to know what my options were, how to protect myself if this thing blew up. That's how I met Jessica, the private investigator. The lawyer suggested her. Said she was good, discreet, and could help me gather the evidence I needed if Molly was, in fact, cheating. I felt a little weird about it, like I was being sneaky too, but at the same time, I had to protect myself. Jessica was all business, didn't ask too many questions, just told me what she needed from me to get started. "You'll want to gather anything you can," she said. "Phone records, texts, emails. Anything that looks out of place. I'll handle the rest." And that's when I really started planning. I wasn't just waiting around anymore. I was going to find out the truth, even if it hurt like hell. I set up a meeting with Jessica to get things rolling, and I started quietly gathering little bits of evidence. Phone bills, Molly's texts when she left her phone unlocked, whatever I could find. At the same time, something crazy happened. I won the freaking lottery. No joke. I'd been playing for years, never expecting anything, just for fun. But that week, out of nowhere, I hit the jackpot. I didn't tell a soul, not Molly, not even Otis. I was sitting on this massive win while my whole life was about to blow up. It was like I was living in some strange dream where everything was happening at once. But I knew one thing, I wasn't about to let Molly benefit from that money if she was cheating on me. Hell no. So I started planning there too, setting up a trust, figuring out how to keep the winnings safe and out of her hands. If this divorce was happening, she wasn't taking a single dime of my new fortune. With the lottery win tucked away as my little secret and Jessica on the case, things started to move quickly. I never imagined I'd be living a double life like this, but here I was, juggling my regular work, pretending everything was normal with Molly, and quietly working to uncover her lies. Jessica didn't waste any time. She set up surveillance on Molly and Frank, tracking where they went and what they did. It felt weird, like I was spying on my own life, but I had to do it. It wasn't just about catching them in the act, it was about making sure I had solid proof. I wasn't about to let Molly twist this around if it went to court. The first few days didn't reveal much. Molly's behavior didn't change much when I wasn't around, but Jessica reassured me. Cheaters tend to get comfortable, she said. It's only a matter of time before they slip. I spent my evenings with the kids, trying to keep up appearances. But even they seemed different around me. It's hard to explain, but they felt distant, like they were picking up on the tension between Molly and me. My oldest, Sarah, asked me once, "Dad, why are you always so tired?" I didn't know how to answer that without spilling everything. I just smiled and said, "Work's tough, kiddo." But deep down, it crushed me. If this thing with Molly blew up, what was going to happen to my relationship with the kids? Would they hate me for leaving their mom? One night, while Molly was out helping Frank again, I got a call from Jessica. "Chad, I think we've got something," she said, her voice serious. My heart raced. I'd been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. Jessica explained how she'd followed Molly to Frank's place again, but this time, they didn't just hang out in the garage or the kitchen. She saw them getting a little too cozy in the living room, touching, laughing, and, well, it didn't look like two in-laws just hanging out. She didn't catch them doing anything physical yet, but the way she described it, it was only a matter of time before they crossed that line, if they hadn't already. I felt my blood boiling, but I kept it cool on the phone. "Okay, keep watching them," I said. "I need hard proof, Jess. I can't blow this up without something solid." Hanging up the phone, I stared at the wall for what felt like hours. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. Molly was getting too close to Frank, and it was only a matter of time before she got sloppy enough to make a real mistake. The question was, how long was I supposed to wait? How long could I keep pretending everything was fine while she was sneaking around with him? The next morning, I took a drive over to Otis's place. I hadn't told him about Jessica or the lottery yet, but I needed to vent. We grabbed some beers and sat on his back porch, watching the sun come up over the trees. I told him about the call with Jessica, how Molly and Frank were getting way too comfortable with each other. Otis just shook his head. "Man, I hate to say it, but you've got to prepare for the worst. You don't want to believe it, but deep down, you know what's happening." I sighed, staring into my beer. "Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to figure out how to pull the trigger without blowing everything to hell." Otis gave me a hard look. "You're doing everything you can to protect yourself. That's smart. But don't let her make a fool out of you any longer than she already has." He was right. I had to stop sitting around and waiting for more proof. Jessica had already seen enough to confirm what I'd feared for months. It was time to confront Molly. I just needed to figure out how to do it without losing my mind. After that talk with Otis, I knew I couldn't drag this out much longer. I had proof, or at least enough to know something was going on between Molly and Frank. But still, part of me wanted to believe I was wrong. Maybe there was some explanation for all this, something that wouldn't end in my life getting flipped upside down. Deep down, though, I knew better. A few days passed, and Jessica kept working, gathering more evidence. Every time Molly left to help Frank, I knew exactly where she was going and what she was doing. Jessica managed to catch them getting even more comfortable. She snapped photos of them together, laughing, touching, Molly leaning in close, almost like she was teasing him. It wasn't a full-on affair yet, or maybe it was, and they were just better at hiding it, but there was no denying what was happening. One evening, after another long day in the oil fields, I came home to find Molly sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced up when I walked in, muttering a quick, "Hey." The kids were upstairs, probably avoiding whatever tension was in the air. I stood there for a second, just looking at her. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone I didn't even know anymore. This was the woman I'd married, the mother of my kids, but now she felt like a stranger. I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey Molly," I said, my voice low but firm. "We need to talk." She looked up at me, her face shifting from surprise to something like annoyance. "About what?" I sat down across from her, trying to keep calm, but my hands were already clenched into fists. "About Frank. About what you've been doing when you're over there." Her expression didn't change much, but I saw a flicker of something, panic maybe, behind her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just helping him out. You know that." I leaned forward, my voice steady but hard. "Don't lie to me, Molly. I've seen the way you two are around each other. You're spending way too much time with him. And it's not just about helping him out, is it?" She crossed her arms, defensive now. "What, you think I'm cheating on you? With Frank? That's insane, Chad. He's my brother-in-law. You're paranoid." "Am I?" I shot back. "Because I've had a private investigator following you. I've got pictures of you too, Molly. The way you're all over him when you think no one's watching. So don't sit here and tell me I'm being paranoid." Her face went pale, and for a second, she didn't say anything. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to talk her way out of this. "You're spying on me," she finally said, her voice shaking, more angry than guilty. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "I'm spying on you because you gave me a reason to." I snapped, my voice rising. "I wouldn't have to if you weren't acting so damn suspicious all the time. You've been lying to me, Molly. Don't deny it." She stood up, pacing the room now, trying to gather herself. "This is ridiculous, Chad. You're blowing things out of proportion. Frank's having a rough time, and I've just been helping him out. That's all it is." I shook my head, standing up to face her. "Cut the crap. I'm not buying it. You're lying, and we both know it. Just admit it, Molly." For a moment, the room was dead silent. She stopped pacing, turned to face me, and I saw her eyes narrow, that cold defensive look she always gives when she's cornered. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "You want the truth? Yeah, maybe I've been spending a little more time with Frank than I should. But nothing's happened, Chad. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Nothing's happened yet," I repeated, almost laughing at the audacity of it. "But you want it to. That's clear as day." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "This is insane. You're acting like a jealous, insecure little boy." I felt my anger boiling over, but I held it in. "Insecure? No, Molly. I'm not insecure. I'm just done being lied to. I've been busting my ass in those fields, trusting you to hold this family together, and this is what you do? Sneak around with Frank like I'm some idiot." She was silent for a moment, then shot back. "Maybe if you were home more often, things would be different." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, staring at her, wondering how the hell we got here. She was shifting the blame onto me, like somehow this was my fault. Like I pushed her into Frank's arms by working hard to provide for our family. I didn't know what to say after that. I just turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there. I didn't trust myself to keep talking. If I did, I might say something I couldn't take back. I went upstairs to check on the kids. They were already asleep, unaware of the storm brewing downstairs. But soon they'd know. They'd have to. After that confrontation with Molly, I needed to clear my head. I couldn't sleep, just sat there replaying the conversation over and over. She didn't even apologize. Instead, she tried to make me feel like I was in the wrong for not being around enough. The nerve of it all. The next morning, I met up with Otis again. I told him how it went down, how Molly barely owned up to anything and turned the blame on me. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "Man, that's classic. She's trying to make you feel guilty to cover up her own crap." We talked about next steps. Otis was more fired up than I was, pushing me to get the ball rolling on the divorce. "You've got the evidence. You've got your lottery money locked away. What are you waiting for?" He was right, of course. But as much as I wanted to be done with Molly, I had to think about the kids. I couldn't just storm out of there without a plan in place. And then there was Bobby, my youngest. Something had been nagging at me. He didn't look much like me, if I was being honest. The thought that he might not be mine had crossed my mind, and now with everything going on, it was haunting me even more. I made a decision right there. I was going to get a DNA test on Bobby. I needed to know the truth, and if he wasn't mine, well, that changed everything. I set up the appointment with Jessica to help me handle the test quietly. At the same time, I contacted my lawyer again, making sure the divorce process would protect me and, most importantly, my money. I wasn't going to let Molly get her hands on a single dollar of that lottery jackpot if she was cheating on me with Frank. The wheels were in motion now. I was preparing for the inevitable. Soon enough, I'd have all the answers I needed. A couple of days after setting things in motion, I finally got the DNA test done on Bobby. It felt surreal swabbing his little mouth, knowing what was at stake. He had no clue, of course, just smiled up at me, trusting his dad like always. The thought that he might not actually be mine was eating me alive, but I had to know. Jessica made sure everything went smoothly with the test, keeping it discreet so Molly wouldn't catch on. Meanwhile, I continued pretending everything was normal at home. Molly acted like nothing had happened after our argument, like we hadn't just had the most important conversation of our marriage. That alone made my blood boil. Days passed, and the waiting for those DNA results was torture. Every time I looked at Bobby, I found myself analyzing his features, trying to see if there was any part of me in him. But honestly, with all the doubt swirling around, I couldn't tell anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. Otis checked in with me regularly, keeping me grounded. He was my rock through all this, reminding me to stay focused on the end goal, getting out clean and protecting my kids. But even Otis knew this DNA test was a big deal. "Whatever happens, Chad, you got to be ready for it," he said. "Whether he's yours or not, you'll make the right call." Then, the day finally came. Jessica called me up. "I've got the results," she said, her voice steady. "You want me to come by?" My heart sank. I already knew from the way she said it. "No need. Just tell me." There was a long pause, and then she gave me the answer that changed everything. "Bobby's not yours, Chad." I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, the weight of it hitting me like a ton of bricks. Part of me had expected it, but hearing the actual words? That was a different kind of pain. This kid I'd been raising, loving, thinking he was my son, wasn't mine. Jessica gave me a few minutes to process before asking, "What's your next move?" I had to think about that one. The plan was always divorce, but now I had to confront Molly again. There was no avoiding it anymore. She wasn't just cheating on me, she'd lied about Bobby's whole existence. It was time to end this, and I wasn't holding back. I sat there for what felt like hours after Jessica's call, just staring at the wall, trying to wrap my head around it. Bobby wasn't mine. That kid, who I'd held as a baby, taught to ride a bike, read bedtime stories to, he wasn't my son. The anger, the betrayal, it all came crashing down at once. That night, after the kids were in bed, I knew it was time. No more waiting. I found Molly in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, probably talking to Frank or whoever else. My chest tightened just looking at her. "Molly," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk. Now." She looked up, her face going blank. "Again? We already talked about this, Chad. I told you nothing's happening." I stepped closer, the fury I'd been holding in finally breaking through. "Don't lie to me, Molly. I've got proof. You've been cheating with Frank, and now I know Bobby isn't even my son." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her face. She tried to laugh it off. "What are you talking about? Of course, Bobby's your son." I shook my head, fists clenched at my sides. "I had a DNA test done, Molly. I know the truth. Stop lying." She stood up quickly, her face flushing red. "You had a test done? What the hell, Chad? How could you do that without talking to me? How could you cheat on me and lie about Bobby's entire existence?" I fired back, my voice louder than I intended. "I've been busting my ass for this family, and you've been sneaking around behind my back this whole time." Molly's defensiveness crumbled. She didn't even try to deny it anymore. She just stared at the floor, arms crossed, shaking slightly. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she muttered, her voice barely audible. I felt a hollow laugh escape me. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What, Bobby just magically isn't mine by accident?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. Not anymore. It was a mistake, Chad, she whispered. Frank and I. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You think I care about your mistakes? I snapped, my blood boiling. I've been raising a kid that isn't mine because of your mistake, and you're still lying to my face. She looked up at me, her face wet with tears. I'm sorry, Chad. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to hurt you. You hurt me the moment you lied, I said coldly. And now it's over, Molly. I'm done. She froze, like she hadn't expected me to say that. What do you mean, done? I mean I'm filing for divorce. You and Frank can do whatever you want, but you're not taking my kids, and you're sure as hell not getting a dime from me. Her face paled, and she started to panic. Chad, wait. We can fix this. Don't just throw everything away. But I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to be manipulated anymore. It's already thrown away, Molly. You did that. Now you're going to deal with the consequences. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, broken and speechless. This time, I was the one taking control. I had all the evidence, all the proof. There was no going back now. After that final confrontation, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and every time I saw Molly, it was like a fresh punch to the gut. She tried to talk to me again the next morning, but I wasn't having it. I didn't care about her excuses or her fake tears anymore. I just packed a bag and left. I moved into a small apartment nearby, something temporary while the divorce played out. I couldn't be too far from the kids, even if being around Molly felt impossible. I wasn't about to let her keep me from them, and I made sure they knew that. Dad, why are you leaving? Sarah asked me that first night. She's old enough to sense something's wrong, but I wasn't going to dump all this on her. Not yet. I'm not leaving you, sweetheart, I said, crouching down to her level. I'm just staying somewhere else for a little while. But you and your brother can come over any time, okay? This doesn't change how much I love you. She nodded, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. It killed me, knowing this whole mess was affecting them too. Bobby, being younger, didn't ask as many questions, but I still hugged him tight before I left. Molly didn't try to stop me, which surprised me. Maybe she finally realized how deep she'd screwed up. Or maybe she was still too caught up in her affair with Frank to care. Either way, it didn't matter. My focus now was on the kids and making sure they were okay through all this. The next few days were a blur of phone calls with my lawyer, paperwork, and trying to adjust to this new life. Jessica was still in the picture, helping me gather every bit of evidence I needed to make sure Molly wouldn't come after my money or take the kids away from me. The lottery winnings were safely locked in that trust, and my lawyer was making sure they stayed that way. Otis came by the apartment a few times, bringing beer and helping me settle in. He didn't say much, just sat with me, watching sports or shooting the breeze, but that was exactly what I needed. You're doing the right thing, he'd remind me whenever I started second-guessing myself. She doesn't deserve you, man. The hardest part was explaining things to the kids. I didn't want to get into the details, but I knew they'd notice the changes. I kept it simple, telling them that sometimes adults have problems that need space to figure out. I didn't mention the divorce yet. I wasn't sure how they'd take it. The day finally came when I had to sit the kids down and explain what was happening. I dreaded this more than anything. It's one thing to deal with the betrayal myself, but dragging the kids into it felt like another gut punch. They didn't deserve this. I brought Sarah and Bobby over to the apartment, trying to keep things light. We had pizza, watched a movie, and for a little while I could almost pretend everything was normal. But I couldn't keep stalling. Sarah, Bobby, I said, turning off the TV, we need to talk about something important. Sarah, being older, knew something was coming. She sat up straight, her eyes wide. Bobby kept playing with his toy truck, too young to really understand. I took a deep breath. You both know I've been staying here for a little while, right? Well, things between me and your mom aren't going great right now. We're going to live in different houses for a bit, but it doesn't mean I'm going anywhere. I'll always be here for you. That's never going to change. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and I knew what was coming. Are you getting a divorce, Dad? The word hit me like a hammer. I wanted to protect them from this, but she was too smart to fool. I nodded, my heart sinking. Yes, sweetie. We are. But listen, that doesn't mean I love you any less. You'll still see me all the time, okay? I'll always be your dad. She didn't say anything for a minute, just wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Then she asked the one question I wasn't ready for. Is it because of Frank? I froze. I hadn't expected her to know anything about that. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I hear Mom talking to him all the time, she said quietly. She goes over there a lot. I thought maybe that's why you're mad. My heart sank even deeper. I wanted to protect her from all of this, but she'd already seen more than I realized. I couldn't lie to her, not now. There are some things going on that you don't need to worry about, I said gently. But what matters is that none of this is your fault. It's between me and your mom. Sarah nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully understand. How could she? Bobby, still clueless, just looked up at me with a smile. Can I still play at your house, Daddy? I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. Of course, buddy. You can come over whenever you want. After I dropped them off at Molly's, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house. I felt hollow, like a piece of me had been ripped out and left behind. But I had to keep it together for them. No matter how hard this got, I wasn't going to let Molly's choices destroy my relationship with the kids. After that conversation with the kids, things started to unravel fast. Word about the divorce spread around town quicker than I expected. Small towns like ours don't keep secrets for long. Everywhere I went, people either looked at me with pity or avoided eye contact altogether. I wasn't ashamed of leaving Molly, but I hated how everyone seemed to know our business. I couldn't even grab a coffee without overhearing someone whispering about it. Otis tried to keep my spirits up. Man, let them talk, he said over beers one night. You did the right thing. They don't know the half of it. But it still stung. And I knew it was only going to get worse once people started piecing together that Frank was involved. Speaking of Frank, he was laying low. I hadn't seen him around much since the blow-up with Molly, and part of me wondered if he was just waiting for the dust to settle before trying to worm his way back in. Otis had his own theories. He's probably scared you're gonna knock his teeth out, he joked, but I wasn't in the mood to laugh about it. Meanwhile, Molly tried a few times to smooth things over. She called me, saying we should talk, for the kids' sake. I didn't have any interest in hearing her excuses, but I agreed to meet. We needed to figure out some kind of arrangement for Sarah and Bobby. We met at a diner in town. She looked like hell tired, makeup barely covering the stress, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. So, she started, pushing her coffee around with a spoon, I think we should talk about how to handle things with the kids. I don't want them feeling like they have to choose between us. I agree, I said, keeping my tone flat. They're the priority here. We'll split time as evenly as we can, and I'll make sure they don't feel stuck in the middle. Molly nodded, but I could see the guilt creeping into her eyes. Chad. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I clenched my jaw. I didn't want to hear it. This isn't about you anymore, Molly. This is about the kids. Let's just keep it simple. You get your time, I get mine, and that's it. She tried again, her voice shaky. But maybe we could. No, I cut her off. We can't. It's over. You made your choices, now we live with them. That shut her down quick. She nodded, blinking back tears, and we worked out the details. After that, I paid the bill and left without saying goodbye. I wasn't going to give her any more of my time than I had to. The next couple of weeks were rough. I had the kids half the time, trying to keep things as normal as possible. They'd come to the apartment, and we'd do all the usual stuff, homework, dinner, playing in the park, but there was always this underlying tension. They knew things were different, even if they didn't fully understand why. Sarah, especially, was distant. I could tell she was still processing everything, and I didn't know how to help her without dragging her into adult problems. I just did my best to be there for her, hoping time would help. One day, I got a call from Jessica. She'd wrapped up her investigation, and we were ready to move forward with the divorce. We've got everything we need, Chad, she said. Molly's not going to have a leg to stand on. Hearing that should have made me feel relieved, but instead, I felt this deep sadness. I had everything in place to cut ties with Molly completely, but it didn't change the fact that my family was broken. No matter how much evidence I had, no matter how much money I kept from her, it wouldn't fix what had been lost. Once Jessica confirmed we had all the evidence, I knew it was time to pull the trigger. I filed for divorce the next day. Walking into that lawyer's office and signing the papers felt final, like I was officially closing the door on everything Molly and I had built together. The years, the memories, all of it was being wrapped up in a legal document. It was strange, but there was a sense of relief too, like a weight was lifting off my shoulders. I didn't tell Molly right away. I figured she'd get the papers soon enough, and when she did, there'd be no more pretending. I wasn't going to play nice or give her a chance to smooth things over anymore. This was it. The end. A few days later, I got a text from her. It was short, just, "We need to talk." I knew the papers had arrived. We met at the park this time, where the kids could play while we talked. I could see it in her eyes the moment I walked up. She was scared. Good. She should be. "I got the divorce papers," she said, her voice shaky. "Chad, is this really what you want? To end everything like this?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes, Molly. This is what I want. I'm done. You should have thought about this before you started sneaking around with Frank." She looked down at her hands, fidgeting. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I snapped. "It wasn't just one mistake, Molly. It was a long, drawn-out lie. You cheated, you lied about Bobby, and you tried to act like it was no big deal. That's not a mistake, that's a betrayal." Tears filled her eyes, but I wasn't in the mood to feel sorry for her. She'd had plenty of chances to come clean, to fix this before it got to this point. But she didn't. Now she was dealing with the consequences. "What about the kids?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want them growing up in a broken home." "They already are," I said bluntly. "We'll figure out the details for custody. I'm not keeping them from you, but we're not going back to how things were. It's over." She wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. "I never wanted to hurt you, Chad." "Well, you did," I said coldly. "And now you have to live with that." The conversation ended there. I didn't see the point in dragging it out. We both knew where this was headed. She could try all she wanted to salvage her image or make herself feel better, but it wasn't going to change anything. After that, things moved quickly. The lawyers were in full swing, handling the legal details. I was focused on the kids, trying to make sure they were okay. Sarah was still quiet, but she was starting to open up more when we were together. Bobby, bless him, was just happy to see me, unaware of the storm swirling around him. Molly didn't fight me on much. She knew she was caught, and with all the evidence Jessica gathered, there wasn't much she could do. She agreed to the terms without much pushback. The house would go to her, but I wasn't too worried about that. I had my lottery money, safely tucked away in a trust, and the kids would split their time between us. The relief I thought I'd feel finally started to creep in. The end was in sight, and for the first time in a long time, I could see a future where I wasn't weighed down by Molly's lies. I could focus on the kids, focus on rebuilding my life without her. With the divorce process moving forward, I finally felt like I was getting some control back in my life. But even with the legal stuff mostly behind me, adjusting to this new normal wasn't easy. The kids split their time between me and Molly, and while I tried to make things as smooth as possible, it was clear we were all feeling the strain. Sarah had started to warm up to me again, but she was still quiet, processing everything in her own way. I made sure to spend extra time with her, taking her out for ice cream or just hanging out at the park, trying to make her feel like things were okay, even if they weren't quite the same. She never asked about Frank or what happened between me and Molly again, and I was grateful for that. She didn't need to carry any more of this than she already was. Bobby, on the other hand, was as energetic as ever, blissfully unaware of the drama swirling around. I found comfort in that. It reminded me that, despite everything, some things hadn't changed. He still looked up to me, still trusted me completely. That was enough to keep me going. Molly, though, was a different story. She was doing her best to act like everything was civil between us, but I could see the cracks. She dropped the kids off at my apartment, and we'd exchange forced smiles, but I could tell she was still struggling. She had to live with the guilt of what she'd done, and I wasn't going to make it easier for her. Otis kept me grounded through it all. He'd stop by with beers or text me to check in, making sure I wasn't getting too bogged down in the stress of it all. "You're on the home stretch, man," he'd remind me. "Just keep your head up." I was doing everything I could to keep moving forward, but there was still one loose end that bothered me: Frank. The guy had basically disappeared. I hadn't seen him around since the confrontation, and part of me wondered if he'd moved out of town. Maybe that was for the best. The last thing I needed was to run into him and have things escalate, especially with the kids around. One afternoon, I was at the park with Bobby when I saw him. Frank. He was sitting at a picnic table, alone, staring down at his phone. My blood boiled the second I saw him, but I forced myself to stay calm for Bobby's sake. I wasn't going to let him see me lose it. Frank looked up and spotted me. For a second, our eyes locked, and I could see the guilt all over his face. He knew. He knew he'd messed up, but at that moment, I didn't care about his guilt. I just wanted to protect my kids from this whole mess. He stood up like he was about to come over, but I shot him a look that stopped him in his tracks. Bobby was tugging at my arm, asking me to push him on the swings, completely unaware of the tension between me and Frank. "Come on, Dad," Bobby said, smiling up at me. I gave Frank one last look, a silent warning, and turned my back on him. I wasn't about to start anything with Bobby right there, but I knew this wasn't over. Frank still had to answer for what he did, even if it wasn't going to happen right then and there. Seeing Frank at the park was like a ticking time bomb. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever, and sure enough, a couple of days later, he reached out. He called me, and though I wanted to ignore it, I picked up. I was ready to finally put this to rest. "Chad, we need to talk," Frank said, his voice shaky. "I know I've screwed up, and I owe you an explanation." I didn't care about his explanations, but I agreed to meet him. It was time to confront this head-on. We met at a bar outside of town, a quiet place where I wouldn't have to worry about anyone seeing us or hearing what I had to say. Frank showed up looking like he hadn't slept in days, unshaven, nervous, a complete mess. I wasn't about to feel sorry for him though. He sat down across from me, fidgeting with his drink. "Chad, I'm sorry, man. I know I've said it before, but I mean it. I didn't want things to get this far." I leaned back, staring at him. "You didn't want things to get this far? What did you think was going to happen, Frank? You had an affair with my wife. You think an apology is going to fix that?" He looked down, his face flushed with guilt. "I know it's unforgivable. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that it's over between me and Molly. It's been over for a while. That didn't matter to me. It wasn't just about what he and Molly had done. It was about the betrayal, the lies, the fact that he destroyed my family. I don't care if it's over, Frank. What you did crossed a line that you can't come back from. You didn't just hurt me, you've messed with my kids' lives. That's the part you need to live with." Frank nodded, but I could tell he still didn't fully grasp the damage he'd caused. He kept rambling, saying things like, "I never wanted to hurt you, and it was a mistake." All the usual crap. Finally, I cut him off. "Frank, just stop. You and I are done. Stay away from me, and stay away from my kids. You've done enough." He sat there, stunned. "Chad, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I replied coldly. "Just stay out of our lives." "I mean it." I stood up, ready to leave. Frank sat there, defeated, not even trying to argue. I wasn't interested in hearing any more of his excuses. I'd said what I needed to say, and now it was time to move on. Part 13, a final confrontation with Frank. Seeing Frank at the park was like a ticking time bomb. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever, and sure enough, a couple of days later, he reached out. He called me, and though I wanted to ignore it, I picked up. I was ready to finally put this to rest. "Chad, we need to talk," Frank said, his voice shaky. "I know I've screwed up, and I owe you an explanation." I didn't care about his explanations, but I agreed to meet him. It was time to confront this head-on. We met at a bar outside of town, a quiet place where I wouldn't have to worry about anyone seeing us or hearing what I had to say. Frank showed up looking like he hadn't slept in days, unshaven, nervous, a complete mess. I wasn't about to feel sorry for him though. He sat down across from me, fidgeting with his drink. "Chad, I'm sorry, man. I know I've said it before, but I mean it. I didn't want things to get this far." I leaned back, staring at him. "You didn't want things to get this far? What did you think was going to happen, Frank? You had an affair with my wife. You think an apology is going to fix that?" He looked down, his face flushed with guilt. "I know it's unforgivable. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that it's over between me and Molly. It's been over for a while. That didn't matter to me. It wasn't just about what he and Molly had done. It was about the betrayal, the lies, the fact that he destroyed my family. I don't care if it's over, Frank. What you did crossed a line that you can't come back from. You didn't just hurt me, you've messed with my kids' lives. That's the part you need to live with. Frank nodded, but I could tell he still didn't fully grasp the damage he'd caused. He kept rambling, saying things like, I never wanted to hurt you, and it was a mistake. All the usual crap. Finally, I cut him off. Frank, just stop. You and I are done. Stay away from me, and stay away from my kids. You've done enough. He sat there, stunned. Chad, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, I replied coldly. Just stay out of our lives. I mean it. I stood up, ready to leave. Frank sat there, defeated, not even trying to argue. I wasn't interested in hearing any more of his excuses. I'd said what I needed to say, and now it was time to move on. On the drive back, I felt a strange sense of closure. The conversation with Frank hadn't changed anything, but it gave me the final piece I needed to fully detach from all the anger I'd been carrying. I wasn't going to let Frank's actions haunt me anymore. He was out of the picture now. When I got home, Otis texted me, asking how it went. I told him the truth. It went exactly how I expected. Frank was a mess, and I got the last word. You're free now, Otis replied. Time to focus on you and the kids. And he was right. The divorce was almost finalized. Frank was out of the picture, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to get my life back. A few weeks after the confrontation with Frank, the divorce was nearing its end. It was just paperwork at this point, but signing those final papers felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't the act of divorcing Molly that weighed on me. I was beyond ready for that. It was the reality of officially closing the chapter on our life together. It was strange, thinking back to how everything started, and how far we'd fallen. The day the papers came in, I signed them without hesitation. Molly didn't fight any of it. She knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. The evidence Jessica had gathered had made sure of that. She got the house, which was fine by me. I had the lottery money safe in my trust, and more importantly, I had shared custody of the kids. That was all I cared about. I met with my lawyer one last time to go over everything. It's a clean break, he said, sliding the papers across the table. You've protected your assets, and Molly won't be getting anything more than what's been agreed upon. I nodded, relieved. Good. I want this behind me. He smiled slightly, like he knew what a journey it had been. You're officially divorced, Chad. Time to move forward. Later that evening, I sat down with Sarah and Bobby to explain that things were finalized. Sarah, always the observant one, had been asking about the divorce for weeks. She seemed to understand more than most kids her age. So, it's done, she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Yeah, it's done, I said, trying to keep things calm and simple. It just means that me and your mom will live separately for good, but nothing changes for you and Bobby. You'll still see both of us just like you have been. She nodded, absorbing it. Bobby didn't say much. He was more focused on his toys, and I was thankful that he didn't fully grasp what was happening yet. I didn't want to drag him into it before he had to be. I'm proud of you, Dad, Sarah said suddenly, catching me off guard. I looked at her, surprised. Why's that, sweetie? For not giving up on us, she said softly. I know it's been hard. That hit me harder than I expected. I leaned over and hugged her tight. I'd never give up on you too. No matter what. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat on the couch and let it all sink in. The divorce was final. Frank was out of my life. I had my kids, my freedom, and a fresh start ahead of me. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine to rebuild. Otis texted me again, asking how it felt to finally be done with it all. I told him the truth. I feel lighter. Ready to move on. He replied with a simple message. You deserve it, man. Proud of you. I smiled, knowing that I had solid people in my corner. It was time to leave the past behind and start focusing on what really mattered, building a new life for me and my kids. With the divorce behind me, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The tension that had hung over my life for months was lifting, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of hope. There was still a lot to sort out, but the weight of the betrayal and the uncertainty was no longer dragging me down. The kids were adjusting, too. Sarah seemed to be finding her footing. She still had questions sometimes, but we talked through them, and I made sure she knew I was always there for her. Bobby was his usual energetic self, bouncing back and forth between my place and Molly's without a care in the world. He was my reminder to focus on the future, not the past. One evening, I was sitting with them at the apartment, building a Lego set with Bobby while Sarah read her book on the couch. It was quiet, peaceful. These small moments, this was what I'd been fighting for. I caught Sarah glancing at me, smiling. "What's up, kiddo?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged. "Just, you seem happier now, Dad." I paused, thinking about that for a moment. She was right. I was happier. Even with everything I'd been through, the lies, the betrayal, the heartache, I was coming out on the other side. Stronger. I gave her a smile back. "Yeah, I guess I am." In the weeks that followed, I started making real plans for the future. With the lottery money safely protected, I set up a more permanent home for me and the kids. It wasn't anything flashy, but it was ours, and it felt like a fresh start. A place where I could rebuild what had been broken. Otis stayed by my side through it all, a constant source of support. He'd come over, hang out with the kids, and we'd joke around like old times. He kept me from getting too serious, reminding me that life had a lot left to offer, even after all the chaos. One day, after the kids had gone to their moms, Otis and I sat out back, watching the sunset. He cracked open a couple of beers and handed me one. "So what's next for you, Chad?" I thought about it for a second, then took a sip. "I don't know, man. But for once, I'm looking forward to finding out." He grinned, raising his beer. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking bottles with him. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself focusing less on the pain of the past and more on the possibilities ahead. I had my kids, my friends, and my freedom. I wasn't bitter anymore. Sure, Molly and Frank had wrecked what we once had, but they weren't wrecking me. Not anymore. I was ready for whatever came next. And this time, I was stepping forward with my head held high, knowing I had everything I needed to rebuild. Stronger, wiser, and determined not to let the past define me. This was my life now, and I was finally in control of it.